Pleasure to introduce Nick White. Nick White is, let's say, one of the longest-standing and most notable Oxford malaria researchers.
Thank you, Kevin, for that most uncharacteristically generous introduction. So I'm going to continue the story that Philippe has just told you, and it'll be from the perspective of Southeast Asia. This is the entrance to a refugee camp, or a camp for displaced persons on the border between Thailand and Myanmar. And although we have a very small proportion overall of the world's malaria and of the world's malaria parasites, unfortunately, as Philippe has explained, drug resistance seems to keep coming from this region. And it's not once, not twice, but 3 times now. So the price in human lives of the spread of chloroquine resistance to Africa was literally millions of children died. That's not an exaggeration. That is the result of parasite genes that originated in Southeast Asia. And then, as Philippe has explained, the antifoal resistance, antifoals followed, they were the drugs that followed chloroquine, and they too came from this very place, Southeast Asia, in fact, from Western Cambodia. And now we have artemisinin resistance again coming from Western Cambodia. Now, if I can work out how to make this work. So this is Thailand is traditionally the graveyard for anti-malarial drugs. You see on the left, the left there, CQ is chloroquine, the last embers of chloroquine utility in the late 1970s, sulfadoxine pyrimethamine, which is an antifoal sulfur combination, following it and dying very, very quickly. And then a brief period when quinine, that's Q, was used before mefloquine was introduced in 1984 in November. Actually, it was introduced in combination with SP, which was an interesting choice. Resistance happened very rapidly. We increased the dose. The dose was wrong. That's another repeated story through anti-malarial drug development, that we introduced drugs at the wrong dose. And so that we increased the dose, but that just provided temporary respite. And actually, by the late 1990s, we were really, really concerned that we would have untreatable malaria by the end of the millennium. And we were saved by these remarkable drugs, which come from a traditional Chinese medicine called Jinghaosu, or artemisinin, for which a Nobel Prize was awarded this year. And so in combination, not a particularly good idea to combine a dying drug with a new one, but that's all we had. So AM is artesunate mefloquine, and DP is dihydroartemisinin, which is another Jinghaosu-like drug, with another drug which the Chinese developed called piperequine. And both did really well for a very long time. But I'm afraid the recent story is not good. And the cupboard, the immediate cupboard, is bare. We don't have new drugs that we can take off the shelf and give to people. We do have, however, a rather healthy-looking drug pipeline, and I'll give you some good news. But before that, I would like just to emphasize how important the artemisinin drugs are, not just for the treatment of uncomplicated malaria, which fortunately is most malaria, but particularly valuable in the treatment of severe malaria. And they reduce the mortality between about 1/5 and 1/3, so a massive reduction in mortality in severe malaria. And we're very worried, because of the nature of the resistance mechanism, that we're going to lose that beneficial effect. This is the plant, and you'll immediately recognize that sesquiterpene lactone peroxide structure in the middle of it. Kevin's nodding. So that's the drug we use now. And that's the drug that replaced quinine, which also actually comes from the bark of a tree from South America. And really, we don't have any alternative but to go back to that bark. So in Southeast Asia right now, if you have severe malaria, unfortunately, there are relatively few cases, we give both these drugs. So what's in the pipeline? Well, a few boring chemical structures. The first group of drugs are synthetic peroxides. So they've got that peroxide moiety, which are the things that look like a spectacle. But they're made, the one on the A is artemisinin, and B and C are synthetic peroxides. So we can make those entirely in the laboratory relatively cheaply One of them, arterilane, is actually registered and used in India today, and artefunimab, or OZ439, is in development. It's still in phase 2. That means it hasn't gone through to the big trials that are needed to establish the safety and efficacy and get the drug registered. So some way off registration. But they represent an inexpensive approach, or relatively inexpensive approach, and it's unclear whether the artemisinin resistance mechanism will affect them. I personally think it will, so they probably are not going to be the answer to artemisinin resistance. Here's another very exciting, one of several very exciting compounds developed by the Novartis Institute for Tropical Diseases, which receives Wellcome Trust support, I should point out, based in Singapore. And this is a completely novel compound. It's called a spiroindolone, and it produces the fastest parasite clearance of any drug we've ever had. We thought the artemisinins were the best. That little cartoon on the bottom right shows the number of parasites in the whole body going down. And the red line is the results of the spiroindolone, sipagmin, and the green line next to it is the parasites coming down after artemisinin. So artemisinins, which are notable for being very rapidly and reliably effective, are beaten by this remarkable drug. This is also early in phase 2, and just to illustrate the uncertainty of drug development, it's hit a bit of a stumbling block because it has some toxicity. We're not sure if that's going to kill it or not. Very few drugs of those that are developed in the laboratory ever make it to human testing, and even that when they get to human testing, not that many make it through to become a drug that you and I can take. Here's another drug, the one at the top left, from the same group. You'll recognize that as imidazolpipridine. Kevin? Yep. Yeah. So that's another completely different compound, not like anything else, and it also, interestingly, kills the parasites in the liver before they grow into the blood, and it kills them in the blood, and it's rapidly acting, and it's well tolerated. But that also is early in phase 2. And finally, the other kid on the block is a drug which really looks a bit like chloroquine. The left part of the molecule is chloroquine, and then it's got this rather clunky side chain with an iron moiety in it, so it's called ferroquine. And that seems to be active against parasites which are resistant to chloroquine and all the other antimalarial drugs, and that's being developed by Sanofi. But what have we got today? Well, there are only two other drugs that aren't, or should I say, not widely used. One of them is atovaquone proguanil. Some of you might have taken that for prophylaxis. It's very well tolerated. It's not very rapidly acting, and resistance develops just like that. One single point mutation kills the drug. So when it has been deployed, as it was in Cambodia, I think misguidedly a couple of years ago, they had to withdraw it within 3 months. It was almost miraculous that it fell to resistance so quickly. And the other one is artesunate pyronaridine, which is pretty good, but has not done well in Cambodia recently. So there's this gap, and what do we do? And this is the last slide. I think the options for the immediate future are pretty grim for us in Southeast Asia, and the most important thing, perhaps from a global perspective, is to make sure the problem stays in Southeast Asia, and that, I'm afraid, we have not managed to do yet. What can we do? Well, those are the only drugs we've got. We can give them for longer courses. That depends on the nature of the resistance mechanism. If it's partial resistance, then maybe longer courses or higher doses we can get away with. To be honest, higher doses are going to be difficult because these drugs are not that well tolerated when you increase the dose markedly. What we're trying is belatedly to combine drugs, even more drugs in the same combination. Now, when we treat TB or HIV or many cancers, we often use combinations of 3 or more drugs. So we're combining all the drugs we've got together. But as I've told you, they're all failing. So again, I'm not particularly optimistic, but the preliminary results are that we can get better efficacy at the moment. And one last point is a simple point, a public health point, that there's quite a lot of theoretical evidence that we should deploy different drugs at the same time with different mechanisms of action. That would slow the resistance down. But that's a sort of prophylactic policy for the rest of the world. But in Southeast Asia, right now, I'm afraid we're really up against it for the treatment of malaria. Thanks.